I am going to begin with a quick welcome and then we will get going with this webinar. So welcome everyone to this webinar called You Can't Have Diversity Without Inclusion. We're here to discuss a new report that's published today called Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Women in Media, Creative and Cultural Sectors in Scotland, written by Fiona McKay, Melody House, Meryl Kenny and Talat Yaqoob. I'm going to say a little bit about the Equal Media and Culture Centre before we begin. So the Equal Media and Culture Centre, or EMCC, is a hub for research, monitoring and advocacy for equality in the creative and media sectors in Scotland. And we're housed within Engender. We're just over a year old now, and we came about based on the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls 2018 recommendation that Scotland should have its own Women in Media body. From there, we've extended our advocacy and research work to the cultural industries as well. And the research report we're here to discuss today is just one aspect of our research. I'm really delighted that we have four brilliant speakers here today. First, you'll hear from Fiona McKay and Talat Yaqoob, two of the authors of the EDI report. We'll then take a short 5-minute break and return with a panel featuring two women who work in the creative industries. We have Victoria Bennett, award-winning author and the founder of the Wild Woman Press, and Nazli Tabatabai-Khatambakhsh, Associate Director at Sanctuary Queer Arts and Opera Libretto as well. So now I'm going to hand over to Fiona and Talat to begin our discussion.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm going to start off by sharing our slides for the presentation, and I'll just do that now. And just to say, I'll just do present. Is that okay? Yeah. So just to say, Talat is going to introduce the project and introduce the context with which we're working, and then she'll hand over to me and talk about some of the findings. And it's just to say that obviously we also did this alongside Professor Meryl Kenny from University of Edinburgh and Melody House from University of Strathclyde as well, who are also hopefully on the call, I think. So I'll hand over to you, Talat, and then I will speak to you shortly.
Thanks, Fiona. If we could move on to the next slide, I'll just do some context setting. Thank you. It would be remiss of me not to put in the context of where this report is being published. We have seen an increasing pushback against so-called DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion efforts. That has obviously ramped up since the election of the US president. I'm not saying his name, the US president, where there has been an active dismantling of DEI efforts in the States. And we're also seeing that happen through corporate industry, different sectors. And that doesn't mean that the UK or the sectors that internationally we are engaged in, which in the creative industries can be a very internationalist sector, that doesn't mean that it will also be immune from those kinds of activities. We risk the small steps of progress being eroded, and really what that does is it illustrates what hard-won rights, how easily hard-won rights can be pulled back, but also how what we perceived as being embedded practice was actually quite superficial to begin with. So it makes us reflect on, if something can be unpicked that easily, what extent of progress was it actually making, and how can we do better to implement change in the bricks and mortar of sectors, of workplaces and of government policy. There's also a risk that even if there is not a pushback within the UK, within Scotland or beyond, that there may be a risk-averse attitude in workplaces to doing more of the systemic inequality anti-oppression work that requires the rolling up of your sleeves, investment, and most importantly, wealth and power redistribution that is necessary. It's likely that we are to see more risk-averse attitudes, which prevents us from embedding the work that I just mentioned. It's also highlighted, as I said, the superficial equality and diversity efforts which fail to look at systemic and root causes of inequality, meaning that that progress can be stripped back more easily. It re-emphasises that the work is about anti-oppression, power sharing, and genuine embedded anti-inequality work, which will create a difference for decades to come as opposed to in the here and now. We are seeing a pushback against things that actually have been quite superficial. So does that mean that this is the time to redouble our efforts for the systemic rather than the superficial embedding of a change in practice, attitudes and systems? So it's really important to understand that actually quite a lot has changed, and particularly the media and political landscape between when this report was finalised in its publication. And what does that mean for how it is received? And if we want to use the report for influencing within sectors, particularly where they have linkages with nations that are taking anti-DEI approaches, what does that mean? And how do we use this in a way that's most effective? So some context setting for you, just to really start this off in a super positive place, but mainly to be able to be cognizant of the reality in which we are all working. If I can go on to the next slide, and I'll just do a little bit of an introduction of what it is that we did. And by we, I mean I had a very small part. The rest of the researchers, and Fiona in particular, will be able to lead on the depth of the analysis. So equality, diversity and inclusion strategies that are aimed at transforming workforces, leadership outputs was a piece of work done in 2023, which focused on institutional and organisational change led by Dr Fiona McKay. And in that work, there was already a review of what's happening within workforces. This is a follow-up report that can actually embed more of that and give us a more insight into EDI in Scotland's media, creative and culture sectors. The report includes a summary of existing work that's happening across EDI in this area. We interviewed 10 women across media, journalism, performance, TV, film, music, libraries and publishing sectors across January and March in 2024. How we recruited these women are those who are known to the women's sector, those who we've worked with in different spaces, and also some cold calling of women who are working in these industries and have either a remit related to equalities or have shared their opinions about equality, inclusion and diversity and underrepresentation, either in media, through blogging or in research practice by their own institutions or organisations. We reached out to them and they agreed to participate. There was also the inclusion of case studies of women participating in and or leading EDI-related initiatives, many of them whom, and we will come to this, were leading some of the work themselves on top of the jobs that they already had. The study reflects on obstacles, the challenges behind the work that they are doing, the opportunities and the extent of effectiveness, and how change might be achieved through additional further initiatives, which might be national, regional, bringing people together, or connecting the dots between the sector itself. And a key theme structured report was produced by researchers. I'm going to hand over to Dr Fiona McKay, who can give you the depth of the analysis that she did. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Talat. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for allowing us to share this report. And I think, yeah, it speaks to, from what Talat has said, the kind of the changes that have been wrought within the time frame that we did this, and the kind of changes, particularly stemming from politics in the US and so on, but Europe as well, in terms of how we might reflect on this following these changes. But I'll just start in terms of talking about, so one of the things that we did with the report was provide a kind of overview or a literature review of some of this work in the media, creative and cultural sectors, and that was led by Melody House, who did a stellar job in this. And some of the key findings of this were obviously the kind of differences in the funding models, work patterns, organisations of these different areas and different sectors means it is very difficult to find a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. Though there are commonalities that we could find within the research. And one of the things we found is that external pressures or obligations, so for example, the public sector equality duty, were good steps in terms of providing ways for organisations to report, collect and monitor data. So these kind of obligations that are starting to become standard practice. However, these have also come with some criticisms about this kind of done without sufficient direction on how to implement these. So, for example, from Close the Gap, and kind of criticisms that it seemed to be some kind of at face value paperwork over change. Focusing on the research that has been done across these sectors in this area, has been looking and has looked at the kind of progress and patterns of horizontal and vertical segregation. And there's been lots of research that have looked at this, but this tends to be in a kind of single axis approach. So this idea of focusing on specific characteristics rather than taking a more cross-sectional or intersectional look at data gaps. And often a lot of the research into these sectors also is done and is subsumed Scotland into UK-wide analysis. So there's very little kind of Scottish-specific data and research as well. But that being said, there's also areas which are kind of focusing on these things. So, for example, the EMCC work, diversity at the top, work done from Pass the Mic recently in terms of election analysis and focusing on content in the media, and also highlighting good practice, whether it is from organisations which have a diversity focus or remit within their organisational structure, for example, Amplify and Birds of Paradise, and those that look to diversifying content, and also want things that focus on career junctures, for example, in the media and STV. So I won't go into too much more details here, but there are, there's some good research that is happening, but tends to be, as I say, in this kind of single axis approach in the first instance. So moving on to some of the findings that we had from our research. So I've just taken out some of the highlights from this. Obviously, I can't go through everything, but hopefully go through some of the main things that would be of interest here. And one of the key things that we found in talking to them, interviewing the women, was that there are certain kinds of obstacles and challenges in terms of recruitment and workplace practice, particularly at critical career junctures. So the women highlighted that there are specific obstacles and challenges in terms of early interventions. A kind of lack of focus where early interventions could be very useful in providing information to schools and further education about these creative and cultural sectors as being a welcoming and diverse place for people to seek employment, and perhaps a lack of support from, say, local authorities, and also a lack of sustained support. So things that maybe are people going in and having a kind of one talk and things like that, rather than a little bit more sustained engagement. Other points that the women raised to do with workplace recruitment and transparency in terms of recruitment practices. So some of the women talked about how their experiences spoke to more of a kind of reactive rather than proactive practice when it comes to recruitment. So, for example, saying we're having an open call about something, or we are providing, our job advert is calling out for, diverse candidates, but not really taking that extra step to be more proactive, to talk to people or to recruit in much more open ways. Another thing that was raised quite frequently was the lack of support for different groups of women, particularly in terms of retention once they've entered into these sectors. So a lack of support for mid and late career progression, whether that was to do with impacts of those with caring obligations or other the kind of different types of patterns of work that make it more difficult for different groups of women to remain in these sectors and industries. And that speaks to some of the comments that women made in terms of the issues to do with pay and pay scales and equalities of pay as well. The women spoke to data and monitoring as being something that was useful. They could see it being useful, but there was a lack of intersectional approaches to these in terms of the collection and monitoring of these. And there should be more focus on this. And also training, so moving on to training as an obstacle and a challenge in terms of focusing on implementing initiatives of schemes, particularly in organisations. So many of the women talked about how these kinds of, and this speaks to what Talat was talking about earlier, this idea of these kinds of schemes and initiatives being superficial, rhetoric heavy or performative, rather than being really embedded. And this was related to sometimes the voluntary nature of these sorts of training schemes. So having it, people kind of, the ones that are coming to these training are the ones that are already involved in these things, and a kind of lack of buy-in from more wider people in organizations. And then also this idea, and this is highlighted in some of the information that the EMCC shared as well, this idea that diversity is maybe sometimes prioritized, but then inclusion isn't really followed up on. So one of the interviewees said, people talk about diversity without recognizing you can't have diversity without inclusion. And they were referring to this idea that, you know, there was the moves to try and diversify the workforce and so on. But once people, a more diverse workforce was implemented, there wasn't much effort to try and make people diverse backgrounds included in the work that they were doing. So again, that speaks to those issues in terms of mid and late career progression and retention. So this idea of not feeling included, even though, and so this kind of superficiality weaving through this. Moving on, other kinds of challenges that the women expressed was this idea of a lack of intersectional or cross-sectional thinking about EDI. One interview said it's like they can only do one at a time. So thinking about specific characteristics and only having one characteristics, often, for example, gender equality focused on, without thinking about this intersectionally, about how women of colour or queer women, women with disabilities might be integrated into more nuanced thinking around these kinds of work. Sorry. Just moved my screen. There also raised points in terms of, as I said, related to these kind of training, this idea that the onus was on people being, on the people who are marginalised, rather than much more structural understandings of how these can be embedded. And I'll share some quotes from some of the women shortly that speak to some of this, as well as this disproportionate burden falling upon women with intersecting marginal characteristics, carrying the weight of implementing these sorts of schemes or training or initiatives. So here are some quotes from some of the women which speak to some of these challenges which they highlighted. So this interview said, you know, speaking to these kinds of silos, gender balance is still a big thing. Once you've got a 50-50 split, people think that their work is done. They don't really go in that extra level to talk about where there's people of colour, people from working class backgrounds, people who have disabilities. And this another interview said that I see a lot of stuff that I see for women struggles to be representative, particularly of global majority women. I think we've still got a long way to go there. So a lack of intersectional focus in terms of just thinking about these kind of single axis approaches. And this same interviewee spoke about her experiences of working in the sector and being part of a steering group, and saying that it was the work that was done was only after she was flagging things to do with nuance within representation and intersectionality. So again, the burden of this labour falling upon the shoulders of these women who are working in EDI potentially and platforming this and being the one to lead this. And while they expressed the opportunities and positive sentiments about being part of these conversations, it was the burdens of always having to lead them when there needs to be much more structural and much more focused support from leadership across all levels. And then speaking to this, I'm just conscious of the time. Some of the other women again spoke to the kind of onus on being on those that were marginalized, saying, you know, I don't want to see any more confidence building sessions. I'm sick to death of seeing them. Speaking to this idea that there's a lack of emphasis on this being something that needed to be embedded structurally. One woman said, you know, I've had HR people say, can you not do just a session for people who feel like they're underrepresented? So just rather than this kind of focusing on this kind of lean-in approach rather than addressing the structural focus there. And similarly, another interview said, you know, it's about teaching women how to do better, and it doesn't actually address the fact that the system isn't there. And I'm just going to move on in the interest of time. Just moving on in terms of opportunities and good practice. In terms of where we could see some positive comments was around the use of data collection, but also platforming and prioritizing more qualitative and lived experiences, which was useful to hear from women rather than just being led by data, but getting real qualitative information. Training was seen to be impactful when it was aimed at organizations more fully and at leadership as well. But there was also some sentiment about the positive impact of EDI consultants. So for example, those who can come into organizations and external run schemes and the impact that they might have on organizations. Network and mentoring was seen to be an important source of support, whether that was internally or externally from other organizations. And there was a real source of allyship found, particularly among smaller organizations, when they shared the experiences and interest in EDI. So this kind of sense of building relationships between smaller organizations which do have an interest and remit for this. And this was seen to be something that could facilitate cross-learning and diffusion across organizations and sectors. Leadership is also seen to be a key site of change. And though there are issues, as highlighted in the report, to do with funding, if this was prioritised and resourced well, this was seen to be something that could be done strongly and positively. And I'll just share a couple of comments from some of the women around these. So these are some of the comments from women who were either involved in EDI projects or leading them and working together within these organisations. So this interviewee spoke to, you know, how being connected with other initiatives gave her more tools to understand what she was doing and how to move forward. This other interviewee said that working in EDI, she was working with another organisation and she could feel the positive impact of them agreeing with her and addressing that and agreeing things that could be done. So seeing the kind of positive ramifications of the work she was doing. And this interviewee 9 said that what they've seen is people who have worked with us, they have given opportunities for organisations to become self-advocates after working with those who are working in EDI and consultancy with them. So having good experiences through these networks and these kind of external relationships. So just to close, so what we've learned, so thinking about trying to implement more transparent and inclusive recruitment practices is really important across the sectors, as well as much more support and attention to mid-career junctures and retention of people within the sectors. Continued data monitoring with research and lived experiences, but of course taking an intersectional approach. Having a greater focus for implementing training or initiatives, particularly in organisations, that there should be a focus that this is for everyone, not just for specific groups, and it should be spearheaded by leadership on the premise that EDI and leadership, for example, diversification of boards can have an impact on both decision-making as well as symbolic and visibility powers there as well. As I said, a greater emphasis on nuanced approaches and these to be intersectional rather than siloed, and providing cross-learning and support across sectors and providing a platform to facilitate and foster some of these already burgeoning and positive relationships. And I just want to end on this last quote, which was a reflection from one of our interviewees who was thinking about her role in her organisation and what she was doing. And she said, you know, maybe that's something we should be thinking about. We're able to convene people, bring the sector together. So maybe the next thing for us is looking for people that we can work with and pull people together. So speaking to this idea of working to try and build more of that cross-sector, cross-learning kind of approach to these things. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be able to have some time to chat with Fiona, Nazli and Victoria. You have a Q&A function, which means you can just click on that and you can submit your questions. They'll pop up to me and I will ask them. The more questions we have, the better conversation we have. Otherwise, we're all just sitting in some really awkward silence. So questions are very much welcome. But as you know, privilege of chairing this, I thought this would be a really good opportunity for Nazli and Victoria to introduce a little bit about themselves as well. So Nazli, if I could start off with you, you have a blog that I think is already on the EMCC website, is that correct? Or going up? Katie can tell me. Yeah. Yeah, it is there. Okay.
Yes, it is there. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the mute.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I put you on the spot. Sorry about that. But it's there for you to read. Now, I've obviously had a chance to read it, and thank you very much. And within that, you talk about something that's really important to me and really came out of this research, which was the value of intersectionality in how it is you design the creative outputs that are being created and how that creates more equity. Can you tell us more about your experience with that and really the extent to how successful you think the creative sector has been in delivering some of that intersectionality?
It'd be my pleasure, and it's a real joy to be in amongst you all today. I said that when we were gathering earlier, but now the other humans are in this space as well. Yeah, absolutely. You know, we know that the work of Kimberly Crenshaw is a trailblazer in this area of working intersectionally, and certainly in my responsibilities, whether it's been as a consultant, coming in as a coach, working as a mentor, being involved with policy writing and development, and as well as being in context as a mediator, intersectionality is key. And in that quality of being able to create an equitable encounter, I think this is what we're all striving to do on a human-to-human level, on a one-to-one level. How do we create an equitable encounter, knowing that this dynamic relational moment requires a fluency of being able to say, I would suggest, look, we don't have years to get to know one another. There is work to be done. Let's not pull our punches. Let us commit to making a meaningful repair. Undoubtedly, in this space alone, I will unwittingly cross a line with someone, but I am absolutely committed to making that repair. But in making that repair, to acknowledge the biases that I hold, to be able to notice when are those becoming prejudices, and those are intersectional human, being able to, I guess it's this, how can we be able to create spaces where we can bring all of ourselves, as opposed to censoring ourselves, as opposed to having to rely on being able to pass in one way or another. So I offer this thinking around, don't pull punches, commit to repairs. And those are intersectional.
I think that's really powerful. And I think it takes a level of courage that I don't necessarily see in a lot of sectors, not necessarily just the creative sector, but across the board. There's, I was talking about people being risk averse, and you need to be comfortable with risk if you're going into that space. How do you think we get there?
I think there's something about being able to notice that throughout your own lifetime, you've taken risks. You've done harder things than this, and you've come through. And it's about what those support networks have been, noticing that your identity is fluid and dynamic, and it requires courage to sit in the thoughts that you're having, giving yourself the right to change your mind, to notice when in your life that's happened, whether that's in your private or your public self. And of course, those things are interconnected. Change is inevitable. It's the only thing nature promises us. And courage requires grace, I think. It requires the right to be messy, to be chaotic in that moment, to know that actually our humanity, the human condition, demands us to care for one another. There's a reason why physiologically I don't have spears and I don't have thick skin. I'm made for connection. I'm made for finding ways to dare to use my voice and to support the voices of others.
Thank you, Nazli. That was really beautifully put.
Yeah, that the solution's in amongst all of us, right? We're all in. If we're meeting this as conflict or difficulty, the solution's with everybody that's involved.
Victoria, I'm really happy, we're really welcome and happy to hear your thoughts on that and the application of intersectionality as well. And again, your blog is up on the EMCC website for folks to read. And I was really taken by your Wild Women salons, not just because I want to come, but because I'm curious as to what gap you think they fill that perhaps the creative industries needs to be putting investment in to fill more themselves. So, you've said, I read that you've had over 1,000 members in the audience. What space do you think that creates, particularly, but Nazli talking there about that courageous space, that coming to it with your full and authentic self. I'd really love to hear how the Wild Women salons actually perhaps enable that.
Thank you. That was Nazli, that was just beautiful. I could have listened to you keep going then. And I just want to say briefly that my son, when he was very little, told me that courage was hope mixed with love. So I'm just going to add that to you. I can sort of hold that in. The Wild Women salons, I think, more than anything, I mean, they are a literary space. They are, they are a platform for high quality writing, for depth conversation, for conversations that move beyond the idea of a marketing machine and place the writers in the center of that conversation, both as creators and as readers. So it's a sharing of work. But I think more than that, what's happened in that space is it's created a kind of a welcome space for that conversation, but is based on an absolute respect of what people have got to bring to that space, whether they're the authors or the audience. There isn't really a sort of divide in that. So everybody that is there is there and bringing themselves. And Nazli, you said in your blog about bringing your whole self, what do we do to nourish ourselves, to bring our whole selves to our situation? And that's what that space is trying to do. And I think that's what it is providing. So my hope with it was first to provide that for the authors. So to give them a space where they felt valued, where they felt that their voices were valued, where they could explore some of the things that weren't normally talked about. Often when you turn up at literary events, you get asked the same questions, and it becomes a kind of, they're great questions, but they become a kind of a condensing of your work. So being able to sort of focus on it in a different way, but also to build community. So alongside the public salons, there are author-only salons for all of the participant authors to come together every month to share their own experiences, and very much a peer-led community. So I think it's that everybody has something to bring, and that's my premise with all of the work that I do, and always has been. Everyone has something of value to bring. We are biodiversity. It's not something that's happening outside of us. And so everybody has something of value. And I want to be part of creating spaces that embraces that and invites people in to offer that, even if they don't see it in the beginning of what their value is or what they can offer. So they might say, well, I'm not a published author. I haven't got 1,000 things that I've done. It's like, yeah, but what lights you up? What brings you joy? What do you contribute in your life? And share that. So
thank you. That was really great, Victoria. Fiona, I want to come to you because, as somebody who was doing some of the interviews on DEI, it's quite a juxtaposition from the type of activity that was being discussed there and the openness, creative space, authentic self, bring whatever you can to this space and it will embrace you, that Nazli and Victoria are talking about, in comparison to some of the types of spaces that were labelled equality and inclusion in the work that was assessed in the report. I would just really love to get your thoughts on that, kind of, because I'm really taken by what we were looking at and what spaces these are creating, and how do we kind of bridge that gap, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally right. I mean, I think reflecting on this, and I think there's the kind of organizational things and this kind of idea of these kind of training things that people can do, and these kind of very rigid things that have these different labels, and how there is maybe a lack of understanding and conversation around what else is being done in these kind of open spaces that is doing all this different work that's really, really positive as well, and how to kind of, I think, impact and help aid people's understanding to see that, often, I think this is kind of the women are speaking to, particularly in those kind of bigger organizations, EDI is something that people do, when they tick a box and that's a bit of training that they've done, when actually it speaks across these really lots of these kind of broad initiatives and broad outlooks and broad approaches that maybe they are considering looking at and supportive of, but they're not really considering it as being part of this kind of broader understanding of it, and how to kind of, I mean, that's kind of hopefully what these kind of conversations can provide, these kind of platforms to how to bridge those gaps, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I was quite taken by the reflectiveness with which you were describing, Nazli and Victoria, what you're doing, and then some of the interviews that were like, well, here's this training, and there's this strategy, and here's this program, and we want 10% to be this. And it's actually us figuring out how those two places can merge together, where it gives different types of activities for people to get involved in. And Fiona, one of the things that's talked about a couple of times within this report and in some of the quotes is about, and I really like the quote that you put up, which was about trying to change the women. So how much did you see kind of deficit model responses happening, assuming that there's skills that need to be built in, or a certain mold that needs to be fitted to that, we need to build women and underrepresented minorities into? And how much did you see kind of that systemic structural stuff that was actually maybe looking a bit more inward to institutions?
I think you'll know this from the interviews as well, Talat, that there's a kind of I guess that tension between that there's including some of the women themselves who are working in these and particularly in maybe larger organizations who see it as something that, I use the term that the deficit, the lean in model, and they still see that as something that is productive, and that we still get quite a few of those schemes where it's about how to kind of change your behavior, how to kind of get the contracts and do this, and how to be more assertive and things like that. And there's still a kind of sense, I say, still quite a kind of prominent sense that these things, and I mean, there is a place for them, of course. And I think some of the women who, have been coming into these schemes find that, I think, finding those places as a source of networking with other women and a place to make these connections, which is really positive as well. So that can't really be kind of discounted for those kind of platforms and spaces for providing allyship as well. But the kind of sense that, there's work done in the sector, but it's something that we need to be doing rather than a bigger structural thing. So I think there is, hard to kind of quantify, how that, that balance, but certainly there is still quite a prominent focus of that across these sectors, I think.
Thank you, Fiona. And I think that was clear in the interviews, is the kind of the response to the skills that, let's focus on the individuals, but then also sometimes responding because the individuals ask for that too. And it's but if it's taken as a step in, that was almost kind of appeased in the interview. It was like, that's okay, we'll accept that. But it's what's happening in tandem with that as well. We've got another question that's just come in, which says, they're aware that it's qualitative research, but would you ever want to replicate the study with a larger participant group to solidify the findings further? I think the suggestions from it are great, but would want to have a greater amount of data to pull from when using it to make major suggestions to companies structurally. So just wondered if that was in plans for future research. And Fiona, obviously, Katie, it's about that was for EMCC, but Fiona, with your wider research portfolio, it'd be really helpful to hear back.
I think yeah, it's a great point. I think it speaks to the kind of, you need to have this kind of research in tandem. So you need to have the bigger patterns alongside the lived experiences. And I think some of the challenges of doing this kind of work in this area is that you also have to, if you're trying to capture these lived experiences, you also have to kind of preserve the anonymity of women, because, the kind of identity of women that, it's very difficult to kind of go into deep kind of analysis and not expose the kind of the small number of women that could be identifiable in these things. And I think having that in tandem, certainly I would love to do some more research in this. I'm actually I'm taking a period of leave. I'm going on mat leave in July, so I will have some. I don't know, not in the foreseeable for me, but I mean, hopefully there's opportunities coming up I think that would be really worthwhile, and certainly something to have kind of a conversation with. And if other people are working in more collaborative research. So obviously this is a kind of open call for doing greater research across this as well. And I'll let Katie come in from EMCC.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what you said, Fiona, I think it's really important to have we need to have the data, we need to have that evidence, but we also need to have the lived experiences, because I think that whenever things are sort of boiled down to numbers, sometimes it can be quite difficult to get people to engage with these sorts of issues. So I think that this is a really great stepping stone to hopefully do more research whenever you come back, Fiona, from mat leave. We'll wait for you to come back, and then hopefully we can explore a little bit more.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll be ready in just like a year later, just to can't wait to get back into spreadsheets, data, and so another question here. What is the headline that you hope the creative industries and those working in the creative industries take from this report? What's the instrumental change that they should be learning from it? Why don't I go to Victoria first, Nazli, and then I'll come back to you, Fiona. What do you hope the creative industry takes from it, and perhaps reflects on?
Oh, big question for a short answer. I think the change has to be, you mentioned about systemic barriers. I think the change has to be a kind of a full-bodied change. It seems to be very much rooted in our sense of humanity and about being able to see each other as human beings and as, that as whole people. So I think that there needs to be work on that, our sense of humanity and our connection with it, rather than specific, you need to recognize this and this and this about people. Those need to be in it, but I think it needs to come right the way back to how do we perceive ourselves, how do we perceive other people, how do we bring everybody into that conversation in a way that allows everybody to be part of it and not just tacked on for the purposes of ticking boxes.
Yeah, thank you. Nazli, I'll go to yourself. Thank you, Victoria.
I absolutely echo what has been said, and especially this emphasis that Victoria brought. Thank you. I would add that for those in decision-making roles, how is it you want to be remembered about how you showed up? And what's the narrative? I think there's something about being able to say, this is what I did in this moment. And it's about taking all the rests that you need, but keep going and know that you're not alone in this. You're not alone in this. But I asked the question, how do you want people to speak of this moment and what you did in that moment? How did you collaborate?
Thank you. And Fiona, what, for those who are perhaps on the call are working in the creative industries, perhaps potentially in a senior leadership level, what do you hope that they take from this?
I don't think I could put it as well as Victoria and Nazli, but I guess to put it succinctly, kind of going inward and looking outwards. So being much more self-reflective, self-critical in terms of the real structural barriers rather than just thinking about the small changes. So going really inward in that sense, and then looking outward to building the learning and building the network. So sharing the learning, sharing the opportunities across the sectors, which kind of often also are quite siloed in terms of how they do things. So having, as I said, Nazli was saying about collaboration, focusing on making this a overall larger sector much stronger through working together, I think.
Thank you. I'm aware of time, and I'm wondering if I can maybe, do you think I can squeeze in a question? I can squeeze the wee tiny one. I say a tiny one, and then it'll be like, and how do you change the world? Discuss. But I think just the emphasis and the headline of the webinar, this particularly makes sense. How do you encourage people to move away from counting the numbers and thinking about inclusion? So we talked a lot about in the report about retention and at key stages in life, women leaving the sector or their role changing within the sector. So and Victoria, you also mentioned tick boxes, so I'll just come to whoever would like to input. But how you count the numbers, but make the numbers count, is how it's been put. So I don't know. Shall I go to you first, Fiona? You can give me your reflections on the report.
So how to, I mean, I think to reiterate, and I'm sure Victoria and Nazli can say it better than me as well. And I think it is just about, again, finding ways to give space for experiences and voices to kind of humanize the numbers, if that answers your question. Finding that space and finding those spaces where it is about providing much more of a human connection to these things and to this data and these numbers, and making and allowing people to kind of make those human connections to those numbers to make it make sense.
Thank you. And Victoria, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that it's just, for me, it's about the quality of experience that each of those individual numbers kind of to experience in that. So in making it count is, part of that might be, for example, making something longer, making something richer. So it's not just about bringing somebody in, but actually making sure that you kind of listen and work with that person to support their needs at different points as well. So making it kind of a richer, broader, deeper experience.
And finally, Nazli, from you.
I would just like to add two things. One is absolutely on being able to be attentive to curating, to experimenting. I think there's been a lot of that really strong work, certainly in Victoria's portfolio and also in the work that Sanctuary Queer Arts does and the people named in the report and beyond, of course. Experimentation, I think, to begin to understand what those numbers represent, what they are in their humanity. And also there's something within the conservatoires, higher education research councils, which is about really working those qualitative and quantitative, so we get that narrative, we find the human narrative through that. And that's what I would offer.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for your inputs, and thank you to the audience for their questions as well. I see that the report has been put back into the chat function, so look at the report, read the report, use it. The wider these things are disseminated, the bigger their value often has within the creative sector, so please do share it. A huge thank you to our panellists, thank you to EMCC, and I just want to check in if EMCC have any final words, but from me, thank you very much.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Talat. Thank you, Fiona, Nazli, Victoria as well, and to Amanda, our stenographer, for her work as well. And yeah, if you just want to follow our work, there's a link to our newsletter. We're on Instagram, and yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.